So thank you all for joining our educational series. During last week's session, your participation hovered around 135 to 150 people. Before I get started, I'd like to cover some housekeeping rules. This webinar is being recorded, and that recording is going to be placed on the webinar's website. Please remain muted unless you're speaking. If you experience any buffering problems, we recommend that you turn off your camera. We will take questions at the end of each presentation. We should have time for additional questions at the end of the presentations, and the webinar team will work on an accompanying Q&A document to post to the website as well. So please use the chat and raise hand feature to ask your questions. Today's session is Carbon Markets, the Supply Side Considerations. So we can get to our speakers. I'm going to quickly go through the introduction slides that we covered last week. The 2022 Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change 6th Assessment Report urges that time for action is now and identifies rapid pathways to cut global emissions by 50% within this decade. In California, the Air Resources Board is working on the 2023 scoping plan update with strategies to balance emissions and carbon sinks by 2045. One thing is clear, achieving carbon neutrality will ultimately require offsetting emissions that cannot be mitigated or reduced otherwise, whether this is at the scale of an individual project or entire organizations or whole communities. Carbon offsets are increasingly going to become an important part of everyone's climate action toolkit. But what are offsets and how do they work? Who can create them? Do they actually reduce emissions? How much do they cost and to create or purchase? And how much or how can we support local sequestration projects and offsets? So these are questions that we had too. We are local governments, air pollution control districts, nonprofits seeking ways to initiate and expand local sequestration projects so we can meet local, regional, and global carbon goals. We are not experts, but over the last 2 years, we've researched and built our knowledge. With this webinar series, we seek to inform our larger community. I'll pause a moment to thank our webinar team organizers. While this series has a bit of a Central Coast flair, we recognize the universal applicability of its content. The first 4 sessions are educational. Session 1 covered last week covered the basics and the advanced inner workings of carbon offset markets. Today's session 2 will go deeper into the protocols, market actors, and considerations of the supply side of the carbon market. Next week, we'll explore the demand side considerations of the market with a perspective of local governments and the university and a project developer consultant. Session 4 will go in beyond the carbon markets and explore ways which land stewards are already caring for land through regenerative practices and how non-market programs can support them. Our final session is designed to be an interactive discussion, offering the opportunity for series participants to engage in open discussions, debrief their key takeaways, and consider existing and future needs and resources to facilitate local carbon sequestration projects and offsets. This interactive session does require a separate registration. While this series focuses on carbon offsets and sequestration projects, we recognize that they are not the only solutions to meet carbon neutrality and supporting land stewardships, nor should they be. The series is not an endorsement of any particular solution, approach, or company. It is meant to be a compilation of practitioners who will share their experiences and perspectives on this complex topic. We hope this series will increase your awareness and interest in the possibilities of facilitating local carbon sequestration and offset projects as ways to improve land management and stimulate local economies. We want to thank our two event hosts, the Central Coast Climate Collaborative and the Santa Barbara County Regional Climate Collaborative. Both collaboratives are growing networks for public agencies, nonprofits, businesses, and community-based organizations seeking to collaborate in addressing the region's climate challenges. We invite you to visit and learn more about each of these collaboratives to find ways to engage. So here's a brief recap of some of the fundamentals we learned from session 1 speakers. And I offer that you take a quick screenshot for reference. This information is important for our supply side discussion today, and it will be important for the demand side next week as well. I'd like to highlight a few. In 2021, John McDougall last week noted that there was about 300 million tons of transactions that took place in the voluntary carbon market. He also said that California is short on offset supplies with a high demand now and in the future. This means that there is a lot of opportunity to develop local, regional, and statewide carbon sequestration and offset projects. And with that, our speakers today are here to shed light on how to supply that demand. Like last week, I will let our speakers tell you a little bit about themselves. Our first speaker today is Kristen Gorguinpour. She's the Vice President of Programs for the Climate Action Reserve. I will stop sharing screen and turn it over to Kristen.
Thanks, Andy. So let's see if I can, right. Great. Can you all see that presentation? Okay, I see head shaking. Good afternoon. My name is Kristen Gorguinpour. As Andy has said, I'm the Vice President of Programs at the Climate Action Reserve. I've been with the Reserve in my second go round the last 8 months, but I previously was at the Reserve from 2008 to 2015. Where I was in various positions on the programs team, working on the launch of the Climate Action Reserve as an offset project registry, and kind of implementing methodologies and protocols. So today I'm just going to give a very high level view of the Climate Action Reserve and kind of like what we do. If you're not familiar with us, we were created by the state legislation to kind of mandate entity level reporting. And over time, we switched to kind of focusing on carbon offset reporting. And so through our work, we kind of have set the standard for standardized offset methodology development. And we, the California Cap and Trade program has adopted 5 of our offset protocols. In terms of the other kind of programs that we work, so we are currently an offset project registry under the California Cap and Trade program. We have our voluntary offset program, and then we have another program called Climate Forward, which focuses on ex-ante crediting, which I'll get into. So I'm going to talk about kind of 2 of our programs I think are most relevant is our voluntary program and the Climate Forward program. This is just a snapshot of the projects that we currently have listed and registered on our system. We have over 700 projects and we've issued credits to 171 million. We've issued 171 million credits to just over 600 projects. So one of the key focuses of the Climate Action Reserve is really focusing on offset quality. And I think in the previous session, the other speakers talked about like what that means. So our role is really to make sure that any credits that are issued under our program are real, additional, permanent, that they can be verified, and that there is no double counting of those credits. So how do we do that? As I just mentioned, the reserve does use a standardized approach to offset crediting. And so what that means is we kind of have two elements. We look at eligibility and the additionality of projects using a standardized approach as opposed to looking at that eligibility and additionality of the project on a project by project basis. We also standardize the quantification of the greenhouse gas reductions or removals. And with this, we think that it really does minimize any judgment calls that are made to ensure that the offset credits really do meet those criteria. It does reduce transaction costs for project developers and kind of, alleviate some uncertainty about, well, how many credits is this project actually going to be issued? And it just creates transparency with the process as well. And it also creates, gives people some certainty about what's going to happen during the verification of that project. So under our program, how are offsets generated? So we have approved methodologies, offset protocols that we issue credits to. Those methodologies are developed through a public, transparent stakeholder process. And so once those methodologies are developed and approved by the reserves board, projects can be submitted to us and register offset credits. And so we do have a standardized approach for how we issue those credits. A project is implemented, a project is listed where it goes through an initial eligibility screen under our protocol. The project then goes through a third-party verification. Once that verification is completed, the project is submitted to us. The verification is submitted to us at the reserve where we do our review of that project and determine whether the project should be issued credits. Once a project is registered, meaning it has been issued credits, we do require ongoing monitoring, reporting, and verification. At the heart of our program as a offset project registry is the registry itself. All of the information about the projects and the credits that have been issued to those projects are publicly available. You can see the public documentation, including the verification reports, verification statements, and all of our credits are serialized on our system. So you can kind of keep track of where they are. They can be looked up and you can see have these credits been used for any mitigation measures. So in terms of which project types we do issue credits to, we have 20 protocols that are applicable in North America. So the US, Mexico, and Canada. We also have a ozone depleting substances protocol, which is applicable to materials sourced in Article 5 countries. So we do have a wide range of protocols for which we issue credits to over a variety of sectors. I think of particular interest to this group is the protocols related to kind of land use and agriculture. So I'm going to speak a little bit more to those protocols just at a very high level. So one of our protocols is an avoided grassland conversion protocol. This is applicable to projects located in the US, and we also have a protocol for use in Canada. And really it's protecting existing rangeland or grassland from being converted to cropland. So trying to mitigate and protect from soil carbon being lost. So as part of this protocol, we do require a conservation easement be put on the property to kind of maintain that property into rangeland or grassland. And the great thing about this protocol is that we have done all of the modeling. So a project can report in a very simple, standardized way. And currently we've issued about 179,000 credits to about 10 projects under this protocol. We also have a nitrogen management protocol, which really focuses on reducing N2O emissions from fertilizer application. And so this is a protocol that we're seeing that would be applicable to certain crops and regions in California. We do have a tool where you could assess to see, like, depending on the location and the crop, is the project eligible? We have had one pilot project go through under this protocol, but we do currently have additional projects that are going through verification and should be issued credits soon. And then our most recent protocol that we just adopted in 2020, and it actually is going through an update right now because we have a project going through verification that has kind of helped us refine the protocol and refined reporting under that protocol. And that's our soil enrichment protocol. And really what that protocol is crediting is adoption of agricultural practices intended either to increase soil organic carbon storage or decrease emissions from N2O, methane, or CO2. I know there were a couple questions about this particular protocol. The great thing about this protocol is that it's meant to be implemented on scale. So we do allow a project to be an aggregate of many different fields over many different locations, and that can be lumped together as one particular project so that the economics work out in terms of the reporting and verification of that project. We do have an additionality tool that kind of outlines what practices would be eligible in certain areas. So under this protocol, there are certain agricultural practices like, no tillage, reducing tillage, fertilizer application, implementing certain crops. Those are typical practices that we might see adopted under this protocol, but they're not always considered, beyond business as usual in every area. So you do have to look at the additionality tool to see if the particular practice you want to implement is applicable in the particular county. The second program I want to talk about is our Climate Forward program. And we just launched this program in 2019. And what it's looking at is crediting future reductions. And so we created this program really to recognize the environmental benefit of project activities like being implemented to mitigate climate. And so the way that we do that is we do issue FMUs, forecasted mitigation units, that represent basically 1 metric ton of CO2 that will be reduced from the atmosphere. Similar to our offset program, we have a registry that kind of tracks all of the credits being issued and provides a transparent registry to see like which projects are being credited. And so the intent of this program was really to help to be geared towards companies and organizations that are kind of thinking about how they mitigate their future emissions. So for an example, one of the big uses of this program is we do see under CEQA, people mitigating future emissions from new development. It's not to be used obviously under cap and trade program, and it's not really meant for scope 1 and 2 emissions claims for like carbon neutrality. Really, it's looking at how can you mitigate future emissions. In terms of just the difference between a offset and an FMU, and I've said this before, but with the FMU, we're looking at, it's an ex ante crediting, meaning the credit's issued before that credit has actually been realized or that reduction has been realized, whereas offset is it's backward looking, and we credit for a reduction that has already occurred. between our two programs, the FMU protocols that we have a wider range of applicability, so they are applicable worldwide. And under our FMU, or sorry, our Climate Forward program, project developers can, or project proponents can submit methodologies to the reserve for consideration for this future crediting, as opposed to on the offset side where the reserve develops the protocol in-house. So just an example of some of the methodologies that currently exist under the Climate Forward program. This is just a quick snapshot of those methodologies, or forecast methodologies. And we'll note we are about to release an update to our reforestation protocol, and that should be out by the end of this week. And to date, we've issued about 500,000 FMUs to 10 different projects for improved cook stoves and pool cover installations. So one advantage of the FMU program is because we're issuing credits before that reduction has been or removal has been realized. It does help with some of the project economics. Under our offset protocol, we do have our offset program, we do have a reforestation protocol, but no one has been issued credits because of the time scale to actually generate the removals associated with that activity. So we've developed under the Climate Forward program a reforestation methodology that issues those credits up front using conservative quantification methodology. And so it does help kind of shift the costs. You're able to kind of cover those costs up front. And we actually have a mechanism in our updated reforestation methodology to convert those credits to offset credits once the reductions have been realized and they can be verified. But getting those credits issued up front kind of helps with the costs of implementing the project. Similar to our offset protocols, we still have the same kind of criteria and standards for the FMUs that are generated under the program. We're still looking for those credits to be real, additional, permanent, confirmed, which is the same as verification, and enforceable, so that they follow the methodology for which they're being credited under. We do take environmental integrity very seriously, and so we do look at the methodologies that are being developed under the program to make sure that they're suitable for that forward crediting, that it can be conservatively quantified. Our quantification does take into account a performance decline or project abandonment over time, and we require project resilience measures, meaning procedures within the project to make sure that it continues for the crediting period. And finally, the reserve does do programmatic monitoring to kind of look at project performance to determine if there's any reversals associated with particular projects. The process for being issued FMUs under the program is similar to what we do on the offset side. If a methodology currently does not exist for which somebody would like to be credited, they do have to go through a methodology approval process. But once there is an approved methodology, the process is very similar to offsets, where a project gets listed, a project is implemented, it goes through confirmation, and the reserve does a review to make sure that those credits met the criteria of the proposed methodology. Under the Climate Forward program, we don't have an ongoing project level monitoring requirement. We do require a project implementation report be submitted with all of the project inputs, information about the project, how the quantification was done. It goes through a one-time confirmation process with a third-party confirmation body who are accredited to ISO standards similar to our offset protocol. And as I previously mentioned, the reserve does do ongoing programmatic monitoring to ensure that projects are being implemented correctly and continuing. And if not, we think about how can we kind of compensate overall for those any credits that have been reversed. So happy, I think we have time for questions.
Yeah, thank you, Kristen. That was great. We do have questions that have come in. So we've got about 6 minutes or so. So we've got 9 questions so far. So
Oh, wow.
we'll do some rapid firing, see what we can get through here. And this first question is for all 3 speaker groups. So Sharon Merritt is asking, can you please have the speakers give some examples of food production agriculture indicating how large the project needs to be, or how large it needs to be in order for it to work in terms of scale? So Kristen, we can start with you and the others can answer during their section.
Yeah, I wasn't clear if it was a particular project type, but I think this goes back to, I think, what I think John was saying in the previous session. You know, these projects do need to go through a project feasibility assessment to see like, hey, will the project work out? We don't at the reserve have a lot of data to figure out, you know, kind of credits per acre of land if it's a forest project or a reforestation project, because there is a lot of variability by project site under the methodology. But we do recognize, and you know, there are challenges when the projects are like small in scale, because not only are there project implementation costs with just like getting the project going, there's ongoing verification costs. And so we try to, at the reserve, think about how we can support maybe smaller project developers, landowners. And so we've built in aggregation under some of our protocols. For example, as I mentioned earlier, with the soil enrichment protocol, like one field is like not going to likely be enough, right, to go through the process of being issued offset credits. And so we have under our protocol, our expectation is that we'll see thousands of fields, hundreds of fields in one particular project to kind of make that scale work.
Great, that's helpful. Okay, let's go to the next one. It's Mary Gilmore, and she's asking, how long are contracts with farmers for these kind of practices?
Yeah, it's interesting. It's an interesting question. So under our the soil enrichment protocol, there's a couple of different ways that the project can be set up. So in some cases, a farmer may contract with a project developer to kind of bring the project through the project registration process and be issued credits. If that's the case, the reserve works directly with that project developer. Under the reserve's protocols, we recognize 100-year permanence requirement. And so the project developer is agreeing to this is complicated, but under 10-ton accounting, we have another mechanism for tenure accounting, but I'll just generally speak about 10-ton accounting. We do require permits for 100 years. So that project developer agrees to the reserve to do ongoing monitoring of that project 100 years after the credits have been issued. In some cases, a farmer might bring that project to us directly, a particular project directly. And same thing, depending on how the credits are issued under the methodology, they may have to do ongoing monitoring, reporting and verification for that time scale, because we want to make sure that those credits aren't reversed.
Okay, great. Thank you. Let's go on to the next one. This comes from Nick, and he's asking, can you explain how avoided grassland conversion projects meet the standard for offset additionality?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we do have an additionality test in the protocol, and under the US protocol, this is actually a little bit more straightforward because we give you the values, but essentially you're kind of demonstrating that threat of conversion. And so we've provided kind of the data to demonstrate that. So really it's a quantification, kind of looking at what we call like the cropland premium to kind of see what the threat of conversion is.
Okay, great. Let's see, Mary Gilmore had one more question, and that is, how can she find out more information about mine methane project requirements?
Sure, she can contact, I think my contact information is up, but if you go to the reserves registry or website, you can contact us at Climate Action Reserve. Under our program, we do have a wide variety of protocols, and we do, for each of our protocols, we have specific people that are experts on that particular protocol, and so that they can answer any questions that you may have about that protocol. Great.
Okay, we've got about a minute left. Carrie Sisto has a question. It's what properties that are wood properties that are currently used in grazing areas be eligible for soil enrichment protocols or for FMUs, as you discussed?
Yes, so we do allow projects to continue grazing under the soil enrichment protocol. And so that would be on the offset side. We currently do not have a methodology under the Climate Forward program for that, because if we have an offset protocol and that methodology works on the offset side, like people should use that protocol. But yeah, that is an option.
Great. Well, that gets us to our time. Thank you, Kristen. Appreciate your discussion and the answers to the questions. And right now, we're going to, if you wouldn't mind, stop sharing your screen, and we'll let Josh Fain share his screen. And Josh is the Director of Forest Carbon Division at the Climate Trust. Welcome, Josh. Thank you. You can take it away.
Okay. Let me see here.
Oh, before you start, just let folks know that we are going to be sending out a poll just asking where you're located. And if you want to, if you could answer that, that'd be great for us. Thank you.
Andy, it's not letting me share my screen.
Okay, would you like me to go ahead and share my screen for you?
Yeah, maybe that would be easier.
Okay.
Thanks. Hey, everybody, like Annie just said, I'm Josh Fain. I'm the Director of Forest Carbon at the Climate Trust. The Climate Trust has been around for about 25 years now. We were one of the first carbon entities in the country. We were created by the Oregon legislature back in the 90s to help utilities reach their mandatory emissions reductions. So we started out by sourcing a lot of offsets. We started out by sourcing all kinds of emissions reductions, and then have moved into the offset realm as that market has matured. And we've helped design some of the protocols, and have sort of been evolving with the market for a long time. But today I'm going to talk about reforestation through Climate Forward, and it's really dovetails well with Kristen's talk, and I'm glad that she covered kind of the harder parts of explaining what an FMU is, so I don't have to do that. But I'm going to talk about ways that we're trying to apply this new kind of credit to create opportunities in reforestation. So Andy, if you could go to the next slide, that would be great. So yeah, like I said, my name is Josh. I work on the project origination side. So I work with a lot of stakeholders to help get projects off the ground. I do a lot of this kind of thing and presenting, explaining how the process works to landowners. I do a lot of site visits, go out and walk through forests with landowners and sort of explain how a carbon project would affect their property, what a contract looks like, and sort of help walk them through the whole process. And then, you know, we also conduct these feasibility studies that Kristen was mentioning to sort of evaluate various properties to see what may work as a carbon project and what may not work. And really, it was a good question somebody asked about that. The scale really depends on the property in a lot of cases. It also depends on where the financing is coming from and what the return expectation is for whoever's putting in the development costs. Development costs for forestry projects, which is what I'm most familiar with, have traditionally been very high. And it's been a problem sort of that we've been working on, and many others have been working on for a long time, and trying to figure out ways to get those costs down, as well as ways to get various kinds of financing in to help facilitate projects on smaller and smaller lands. And I think there's definitely been improvement in that area. I mean, and the biggest thing that's happening that's helping is the price of carbon going up, right? So that makes it possible to do projects on smaller and smaller properties. So you go to the next slide there, Andy. So yeah, our mission at the Climate Trust is to help scale nature-based solutions to find quality nature-based ways to offset climate emissions. I think I already covered most of this, but our primary sectors that we work in are forestry and grasslands. So we develop a lot of avoided conversion of grassland projects that Kristen was talking about. We have done some anaerobic digester projects as well, and we have quite a few improved forest management projects. And now we have several reforestation projects listed under Climate Forward. This is going to be what I focus on most today in this talk. But I think we have about a 95 project portfolio right now with over $45 million in carbon financing currently. So, like I said, luckily, Kristen covered kind of the difficult part here, which is sort of explaining what an ex-ante credit is and a forecasted mitigation unit, which is great. But at the Climate Trust, we think this is really great because, as Kristen was talking about, this really makes reforestation projects possible through carbon financing. Whereas in the past, the return horizons for the investment were so long and there was a lot of risk involved. So it was very difficult to sort of use carbon financing and carbon offsetting as a way to get reforestation projects onto the ground. So the way it kind of works in a little more detail around the reforestation is there is a great paper out there called the Smith et al. Paper that was published in 2006 by the Forest Service, and it projects growth rates and carbon sequestration from all these different forest types all around the country. So CAR has created this tool where you can plug in your forest aspects and it will sort of spit out these projected FMU for mitigation units. And it's basically looking at how much carbon is going to be sequestered over the rotation, the average rotation length of that forest type. And then it discounts for mortality and some other things and gives you sort of a conservative number in terms of how much carbon that's going to sequester. And you can sell those tons at the beginning of the project Basically, you have to wait a year after the trees have been planted, at least up to a year. So you plant the trees, you wait at least a year, you come out and you do a confirmation with a third party confirmation body. There's protocols for how you set up some plots, and you say, is 70% of this planting surviving? And if it is, then you can basically issue those FMUs because it's within that modeled carbon. Yeah, like I said, it's a really great way, innovative way to finance reforestation costs that have like this high upfront cost, right? I mean, it takes a lot to do the site preparation, to get ready for the planting, to buy the seedlings, to pay the crews to go out and plant the trees. So you have this big upfront investment. And then of course it takes many, many years, and in some cases decades, to sequester enough tons of carbon to pay for those initial costs. And then in the meantime, you might have mortality and this kind of thing. So that it's been a huge challenge and something that carbon markets have been wrestling with for a long time. And so we're excited about this, and we're moving ahead with several projects that I'm going to address as we go forward here. So Andy. Yeah, there we go. So just to sort of illustrate what I was talking about, and this is just 1,000 productive acres in the Southeast United States. And it's just kind of showing the cash flow situation here, where you have a big cost in the beginning of the project, and then, it's taking some time to get positive. This is under an FMU type of scenario where we're selling FMUs as we, no, I'm sorry, this is under an ACR thing. So like, this is just showing that it takes about 8 to 10 years to get cash positive under these other protocols. So, and that's under a very productive scenario. So you can imagine in the West, in drier forests where the forests have lower growth rates, it's an even longer time horizon. One good market we see, of course, as Kristen mentioned, these FMUs are not really intended to serve the same role as a normal carbon credit. But they are intended to offset future emissions. So climate forward projects can qualify under the California Environmental Quality Acts. And my understanding is that's still sort of being worked out, the rules for all that. But some districts have apparently adopted this, where people can use these to sort of meet their CEQA requirements. And I imagine there's people here, maybe Andy and Clay, who know more about CEQA than I do, but I think hopefully this creates a market for these FMUs where we can really get a lot of good reforestation projects out on the ground. And while, they don't act exactly like a normal credit, the potential is amazing, right? Because we all know we need to plant a lot of trees out there. It's a huge part of the climate solution, and just to invest in the future, not only dealing with our emissions today, but our emissions into the future. And so it would be a shame to not take advantage of that and not use carbon financing for that, just because we couldn't figure out the exact accounting. In my opinion, it would be a shame. So I think this is great that CAR has been willing to move forward with this, and that it's dovetailing with CEQA compliance. So a specific area we're focusing on at the Climate Trust is working with tribes to reforest after wildfire, and particularly tribes in the Western US. As everyone on this call is aware of, I'm sure, wildfires have been increasingly impacting the Western US. One of the many impacts of climate change that we're seeing to forest. So something, wildfires do obviously is they release a lot of carbon into the atmosphere, but they also threaten the forest's ability to sequester carbon into the future if they are decimating the seed supply. And this is what high intensity fires do, is they really decimate the seed supply. And so without human intervention, these forests can take a very long time to reestablish themselves. And in some cases, they don't seem to be reestablishing themselves at all. So many co-benefits to these projects. I mean, there's great social benefits as well as ecological benefits, provides a lot of habitat and critical ecosystem services like clean water and air. The financing itself provides economic incentives for underrepresented groups. A great example is a project that the Climate Trust worked on several years ago now in Northern California with the Yurok tribe, helping them purchase and reclaim some of their ancestral lands using carbon financing. And these projects align really well with a lot of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. So we think tribal nations, and this might be on the next slide, Andy. What's that? Maybe go to the next one. There we go. A lot of tribes have really strong reforestation programs as it is, and they're working hard every year to plant thousands of acres. They have limited funding and thus limited capacity. They have a lot of traditional ecological knowledge in terms of the best ways to plant these projects. And I could tell you so many stories about the really innovative things I've seen tribes doing on the landscape to increase the survival rates of seedlings. And so we believe that there's a lot to learn from the way they're doing these, and setting up these carbon projects in one way is a great way to sort of facilitate knowledge sharing across tribal boundaries and state boundaries. But we saw an opportunity here to really help tribes scale their efforts to replant after wildfires using this climate forward protocol. So currently we're working with 3 tribes in the Pacific Northwest. We have 3 projects listed on CAR's registry. We're hoping to get a lot more on soon in the coming years. These projects, as Kristen mentioned, they haven't gone through confirmation yet. We're hoping to do the first confirmations next year and to issue our first FMUs from these projects next year. So we really think that there's a great potential here. These projects, they're a great story, right? It's not just about the tons of carbon that we're helping take out of the atmosphere, right? We're helping restore tribal lands and help tribes sort of maintain their sovereignty, boost their capacity to increase their plantings. And so we see a lot of great co-benefits to these projects, and are really excited about moving some of these forward. So I think that's all I had. I think that's all the slides I had. So I'm happy to take some questions too. Andy.
Okay, great. Thank you. Let me stop sharing screen here. Okay, let's get on to some of the questions that we've had come in. Let's see, the first question came in from Sharon Merritt, and that is, development costs are high. So can you give us some idea of what that means in terms of actual dollars for a forestry project, for example?
Forestry projects can cost as much as $300,000 to develop. That's kind of on the high end. I would say anywhere from $150,000 to $250,000 is sort of what we see a lot of. It depends on how big the project is. You do get efficiencies of scale, which is why larger projects have been favored and really the only ones that have been feasible in the past. And a lot of that cost is the inventory costs. I mean, we have to go out and take pretty meticulous measurements in the forest to make sure that, we're being really accurate on the carbon accounting side. Then we have to do a lot of modeling. We have to model how much carbon is going into wood products. We have to model all the harvest. So there's just a lot of work that goes into it to make sure those offsets are, very rigorous. They're real, they're additional, they're permanent, all of those kind of things.
Okay, great. Another question here is from Hannah Eckberg, and that is, are their credits for preserving forests rather than cutting them down. I think that's the main gist of her question. And I think going to the Yurok tribe project that you were mentioning, that isn't a good example of that. Is that correct?
That is a good example of that. So the Yurok lands that we were talking about were industrial timberlands for many decades. And the way you're able to get carbon credits from those is by changing management practices. So basically what we do is we look at what the economic incentive is in terms of harvest rotation. So in the Pacific Northwest, for instance, it's very common to harvest Douglas fir on 40-year rotations. And that's kind of what the economic incentive is. So if you're willing to say, sign a contract saying you'll grow your Doug fir for 100 years, then the difference between 40 years and 100 years in terms of carbon is what you can get paid for and issue credits for. And that's a very simplified explanation, but that's kind of the gist of it.
Great, thank you. So Carrie Sisto has a question, and that is to clarify, are FMUs only associated with tree plantings and forestry projects?
No, and I'm a forester, so that's what I work on, but no, I think you can do pool cover projects. Kristen is better to answer this than I am, but.
Yeah, so we do currently have 6 approved climate forward methodologies. So solar PV, so retrofitting buildings with solar panels in disadvantage, it needs to be in a disadvantaged community, anaerobic digester projects, improved cook stoves. So kind of a switch to a more efficient cook stove. And then as Josh just said, the pool cover, which is kind of recognizes the energy savings generated from using pool covers.
Great, thank you. Okay, Kara Rogers has a question, but I think that question is actually going to be probably answered better by Nori, so we'll hang tight on her question. And then let's see, Chris Harlan has a question. Will there be any plans, the Climate Trust, for the Climate Trust to work with coral, marine grasses, and mangrove wetlands in the future? And then there's a second question I can cover later.
Great question. We're very interested in blue carbon projects, which is sort of the encompassing term for those. We're exploring some options there. So yes, we do have plans to hopefully work in that area.
Great, and maybe to Kristen, is that are those blue projects, are those ones that you're looking for to develop protocols for within Climate Forward?
Maybe not in Climate Forward, but potentially under the offset side, we are kind of looking at opportunities there. But we do, under our Mexico Forest Protocol, we do have quantification for like a mangrove type projects. So that's kind of one avenue we currently have.
Great. Okay, Josh, next question. Seth Hathaway, is there a 100-year permanency requirement? If not, how is the permanency factored into the type of reforestation? How does the conversion from FMUs to traditional offsets work? So a couple questions there.
Those are really good questions that I would love to let Kristen answer. I'll just let you answer those because I'm sure my explanation would not be as good as yours.
Yeah, so under our offset protocol, we do have mechanisms for ensuring the permanence requirement, but because we have a buffer pool and we have a project implementation agreement where projects are kind of agree to, it's a legal mechanism, a legal contract that they'll continue reporting. Under the reforestation protocol, under Climate Forward, we look at a 40-year crediting period, but we do still kind of consider a credit or reduction permanent at 100 years. And so in the protocol that the methodology that we're going to release this week, we do have a mechanism for a permanence risk pool. So in the event that there is a reversal of those credits on a reforestation project, we would look at, we're going to look at the program kind of holistically, programmatically, and we have a mechanism for kind of compensating for any reversals that happens there. In terms of conversion of the FMUs to CRTs, essentially what would need to happen is that you or a project developer is essentially going to kind of re-verify the project under the offset protocol. And so there'll be some similar kind of third-party verification. Some of the quantification needs to be redone because under the climate forward methodology, the quantification is very conservative. It's likely when you convert credits, you might end up with more on the offset side, but essentially you're kind of re-verifying those credits under the offset protocol.
And it's very interesting for me to hear that too. Correct me if I'm wrong though, but like the way the FMUs work for reforestation projects is it assumes you're going to grow the trees to commercial maturity. So like it has a set rotation length that's based on the average rotation length for a given species. Let's say ponderosa pine in the Northern Rockies, I think is about 55 years. So it looks at how much carbon is going to be sequestered in those 55 years. And it credits you for that much carbon. So it's done in ton years instead of a ton, which is 100-year ton. So it's a little bit different accounting. It's kind of in the weeds, but it's good because it doesn't assume that a landowner is going to hold on to that timber way beyond, what is commercially viable. It's just sort of incentivizing planting forests where there are no forests. And then it's assuming that when those forests hit commercial viability, that they will probably be sold.
Great. Thank you, Josh. Thank you, Kristen. Appreciate that. I think we're going to cut that off for here. We do have other additional questions that we'll try to get through answered on the document that will be posted up online. So with that, I would like to turn it over now to Radhika Mulgovkar. She's the head of supply and methodology. She's going to be also accompanied with Sean Forrester. He's a supply account manager with Nori. And then they have a project developer with them as well, Claire Pluard. So I'm going to let you guys take it over. Thank you.
Thanks, Andy, and thanks everyone for having us here. My name is Radhika Mulgovkar. As Andy mentioned, I work at Nori as the head of supply and methodology. So essentially my job is to operationalize our carbon credits and develop new methodologies. So I'll take you through a quick overview of Nori, but I think the more interesting person to hear is from Claire because she's actually gone through the process. So I will turn it over to her as quickly as I can. So with that, why is this not letting me? Oh, there we go. So we are a carbon marketplace that was founded in 2017, and we launched in soil carbon, but we are actually carbon removal agnostic. And we will be developing new methodologies in other types of carbon removal, like direct air capture, blue carbon that was mentioned earlier, forestry, you name it, we're interested in developing it, but we started somewhere and we started with soil. And really our main mission, and in addition to reversing climate change, is to really help drive price discovery around carbon. So what do we sell? We sell what's known as a NRT, or a Nori removal ton. And a NRT is essentially the carbon credit that we create. And I'm starting with sort of an overview of what it is and how we make it. So essentially we have a project that's where we work with farmers or people like Claire, who are data managers, to input a whole bunch of data to Nori about different things from switch date to land management practices. And I'll go into more detail about that. From that, we send all that data to a third-party carbon measurement tool, or CQT is what we call it, a carbon quantification tool. And the tool that we currently use is Soil Metrics. We launched with Soil Metrics because of their relationship to the USDA. They are the greenhouse gas implementation tool that was developed between the USDA and Colorado State University. And Soil Metrics is basically the commercialized version of Comet Farm, which is the academic version that was developed between those two institutions. From there, after we have quantified the amount of carbon, we go through a verification process, which was also mentioned by some of the earlier presenters. Verification is essentially a third-party data audit, and it makes sure that the projects are doing exactly what they say they're doing. Finally, in phase 4, we generate the NRTs in our marketplace. We generate them on the blockchain, and I'll get into that a little bit later. And finally, we sell and retire the NRTs to our buyers. So kind of how do suppliers fit into this process? And like I said, we launched in soil carbon. And so we work with people who have adopted regenerative agriculture practices. Our first methodology is known as the US croplands, and it's all about increasing soil organic carbon. As I mentioned before, we use Soil Metrics, and what we need from farmers is 30 years of farm data. Claire has lots of information about what that's like, but we are looking for suppliers who have adopted a regenerative agriculture practice since 2011, that have quality farm management records. They're able to provide digital fields of boundaries that they want to enroll in our marketplace, that their fields, like I mentioned, are US based. That's a limitation of our tool, Soil Metrics, which has only got US based modeling. There are no CRP restrictions on it since 2000. And that's it, sorry. So I wanted to walk you through kind of an example of how a supplier project would work. So the reason we need 30 years of data, which can be very overwhelming, is that we need to do a couple of different things with that data. For the sake of the model, this gray area is the historical data that helps spin up and create the underlying model for that project. Additionally, we have to create a baseline, which is this gold line here, or yellow line, that is the historical agronomic practices. And it has to be basically 10 years from the switch date. So each of our projects need a switch date that is no later than 2011 at this point. In this example, we're using 2012. So in this case, we have 10 years of data before the switch date. So from 2002 to 2012. And then we have a switch, and the switch is when basically a new regenerative agriculture practice was put in place. One thing that I like to highlight here is that we don't prescribe practices, and farmers who have adopted a new practice, even if they've, let's say, been no-tilling for 20 some years, but in 2012 they add in cover cropping, they would qualify for our marketplace. So we are always happy to see farmers who stack practices, and we always want to reward farmers who have adopted new practices. So from there, we have the Soil Metrics projections, which are 10 years after the switch year. And that's basically the amount of carbon that has been sequestered in the soil. And what we do, and this slide is slightly outdated, is provide NRTs, or our carbon credit, that are 4 years from the current year. So those are called our grandfathered NRTs. So if you had qualified for our marketplace in 2022, if you'd enrolled, you would be eligible for carbon credits from 2018, 2019, 2020, and 2021. Once a farmer has seen their projection and they've decided to move forward, they sign an NRT agreement, which basically has some requirements in it that I'll go through in a minute. But the most important one from a farmer perspective is the amount of time they are required to keep the carbon in the ground, which is 10 years from the date that the NRT is signed. So our permanence factor is 10 years. So data collection, again, an area Claire knows really well, but this is where you enter the historical farm practices, the regenerative switch year data, and the farm practice projections into the Nori application. I'm going to make sure I didn't skip a slide. I did. Then you get to skipped a whole, oops, sorry guys, I'm having problems with my slide deck here. Not sure what's going on. Sean, any ideas?
It looks like it's letting you go back now.
Yeah, now it's going back. Sorry about that, guys. Anyway, so data collection, like I was saying, we enter historical farm practices and capture the information I was mentioning. And the type of regenerative ag practices that we're looking for are things like cover cropping, no-till or reduced tillage, manure usage, different crop rotations. Those are kind of in regenerative grazing as part of you as a cropland. So it's not a separate like grazing land project. And from here, you can see some of the additional information we capture, things like boundary files. And what happens is then we take the data, the boundary files, we create the projection for you for a farmer. At that point, they know how much their project is worth from a purely cash perspective. They haven't yet provided any cash or payment to anybody. It's all been time. And they get to decide if they want to move forward. I wanted to, before we kind of move to the verification piece, kind of talk through our additionality and how it works. So as I was mentioning, we capture the old practices, which in this slide is the light blue. Then we capture the new practices, which were adopted at the switch date, and that's the gold. And then you have the switch date in this case, which is 2020, or the year that they enter the project into the Nori system, which is 2020. So you have a switch date of 2016, and you have the Nori the project coming into Nori in 2020. What happens for our additionality is that the difference between what would have been the hypothetical continuance of old practices versus what new practices were adopted, that difference between the two is what we monetize as our NRT, which is, like I said, the Nori carbon removal ton. And what that represents, what our carbon credit represents, is essentially 1 ton of carbon dioxide removed from the air, sequestered in the soil for 10 years. And so the difference between this gold and this light blue line is what we monetize into our carbon credit. And that's our idea of additionality. That's how we see additionality. So from there, once a projection is provided to a farmer, this is when they really have the choice whether they want to move forward or not in our marketplace. This is when we move into verification, which is the supplier's choice. However, the supplier does have to pay the verifier. And so I think some of the questions that I've seen are sort of around what size farms do you do generally work within your marketplace? And honestly, we want to serve all size farms, but the reality is that at the value of the carbon marketplace or carbon credits right now, plus the amount of carbon that most fields sequester, which we're seeing about 0.6 per acre, smaller farms have a hard time making it work because verification costs somewhere between the range of $3,000 to $5,000. So the smallest farm we've brought through is about 500 to 600 acres, I believe. And like I think was mentioned before, we do encourage aggregation of farms. And our verifiers allow it, but that is definitely a barrier that we see, unfortunately, and we are working to get better at that, but we haven't quite cracked it yet. So these are the types of verifiers that we've worked with in the past. We most often work with Astra Global, so they have done the vast majority of our projects. We also would work with SCS Global and Validus, which is, and the way it works essentially is when a project has gone through the projection phase, farmer has decided to move forward and has enough carbon removal credits that they feel like it's worth it. We provide information to all of these different verifiers. The verifiers provide bids to the farmer, and then the farmer gets to choose who they want to work with. And what a verifier really is trying to do is, one, ensure that there's reasonable data. Two, ensure there's proper carbon accounting. So make sure that the third party has not listed it in any other carbon marketplace. And then the third thing they do is confirm legality, make sure that the farmer has the ability to participate in our marketplace. We work with both farmers who own their own property and lease their own property, as long as if they're leasing their property, they just have to demonstrate that the owner of the property has given them permission to sell that carbon removal credit on our marketplace. We call it an assignment of authority. The most important piece, though, really from our perspective, is that the verifier is there to make sure that there's evidence of the switch date and that there's evidence of the agronomic practices that have resulted in the carbon being sequestered. And so this is sort of just an overview of what I just spoke to. Finally, or not finally, but the last part of sort of the enrollment process is generating the NRT agreement. So after a verifier has given us their approval, they write us a report, we publish it to our website along with information about the project. But before we can publish anything or move forward, an NRT agreement has to be signed. And this is where our permanence comes in, where basically the farmer has to commit to keeping the carbon in the ground for 10 years after the NRT is issued or the agreement is signed. They basically happen at the same time. And that, like I said, is our permanence factor. But more importantly, it's sort of rewarding farmers for they're getting prepaid to keep the carbon in the ground for 10 years is kind of how we think about it. They are also in the contract, they are committed to update their farm records every 3 years and verify at least every 3 years. At every verification event, they can choose to basically re-up their contract. So every time they provide us new farm records, they'll get a new projection of their carbon removal credits. And they can make a decision to verify at that point or not. If they choose to verify more than every 3 years, say they choose to verify every year, every time they do a verification and every time they sign an NRT agreement, essentially they are committing to keep that carbon in the ground for another 10 years. So we see this as sort of a constant increasing the length of time that the carbon is in the soil, because every time they sign a new contract, it rolls an additional 10 years. We're so young, we haven't yet seen whether that works out or not, but we do have our first farmer who was paid going through verification again. So we are pretty optimistic that we'll get the flywheel going and people will continue to maintain those practices and keep the carbon in the ground. They also set the price of their NRT, and so which is currently at $15. We are expecting to go to $20 in May, so that's excellent news for the farmers. They get to keep that full amount. Nori makes its revenue by charging a fee to the buyers of 15%. So when you purchase an NRT from our marketplace right now, you're paying $17.25. In a few weeks, you'll be paying $23. The $3 would go to Nori and the $20 would go to the farmer. You have a commitment to sell at least 15% of your NRTs on the Nori marketplace. You can list the other up 85% on another marketplace. This provision will be going away shortly. And honestly, everybody lists all of their NRTs on the Nori marketplace. And like I mentioned, the contract, the carbon has to remain in the ground for the duration of the contract, but we do have a force majeure clause for events due to weather and things like that. And from here, we issue the NRTs. And I promised I'd talk a little bit more about why we issue on the blockchain. We do that from a double accounting perspective. So in the past, there's been issues with carbon credits being traded and traded and traded and traded, but actually no new carbon being drawn down every time those credits were traded. So our solution is that our NRTs are issued on the blockchain. When a buyer purchases it, they get a certificate, where we retire what is essentially an NFT, a non-fungible token, off the blockchain. And from there, it can never be resold again. And so we think that that creates a virtuous cycle of continually drawing more carbon down. Okay. So the buyers we work with all types of buyers. We've hit a niche in the Web3 space and the crypto space because they really understand what we're doing and are also, fellow crypto companies. And the results so far, this is actually an old slide as of January, but as of now, I think we've paid 12 farmers well over $1.3 million. We are sold out of our supply right now and working with our verifiers and other farmers to get more projects in. I think we're at over 80,000 NRTs that we have sold. And our average farm size is, I think, Sean, you just gave me that information. What was it again?
Just short of 2,000 acres.
And how much? And we get about 0.6 NRTs per acre. So that gives you an idea of what an average project would look like. With that, I will say, thank you. I could go all in. We also have a whole nother part of our marketplace, which is our crypto piece. We'll be launching our Nori token here in the summertime in June. That's what we believe will facilitate price discovery. But I actually really want to give Claire a chance to speak or answer some questions, because I think she has insight that I don't have, having never actually brought a project all the way through. So Sean, Claire, I'll turn it over to you two and stop sharing.
Awesome. Thanks, Radhika. Claire, thanks so much for being here. Thanks for coming. For the sake of time, the first question kind of tease you off pretty well. I was just going to have you tell us a little bit about yourself, and carbon yield, and how you ended up finding and eventually partnering with Nori.
Sure. So I'm excited to talk. I think, Radhika, you're right. A lot of the practical pieces of this credit application is challenging. But I'm Claire. I'm based in Chicago, so I'm not a California native. But Carbon Yield, my company, supports and promotes the transition to regenerative agriculture for any sort of farms. And I have been partnered with Nori since early 2020, so since early days of Carbon Yield, and it feels like early days of Nori. And currently have a aggregated project of 6 farms going through verification. And so one of those farmers is actually on the call too. And our farms range in size from like 3,500 acres to a 60-acre single field. So definitely can be done. And what it basically means to go through an aggregated project is that I work with farmers to do a data management process. We start with a feasibility study, and from Carbon Yield purposes, it's really just helping you organize your information to meet those standards that Nori has created. And we're always excited to work with Nori because they are really the most tangible, practical way to approach a carbon credit in the soil carbon world. And so while the data seems like a heavy lift, I think having someone who knows what to look for can make the process really easy. We just do some interviews. We can collect and organize data from your own data management systems, depending on what you have. And from there, it can give you kind of an estimated carbon storage number on your own field. And like for our aggregated project, the fixed cost of going through a project, once you know what you can get on your field, is that verification cost that Radhika mentioned. And so if you split $3,000 to $5,000 or a little higher across 6 farms and a lot more acres, it becomes a much lower cost. So once you know what you can get on your single field or however many fields you want to bring through and that verification cost, then you can really see how this project plays into your long-term profit and revenues.
Awesome. Claire, you answered like 4 of my questions right there. No, that's awesome. Thanks so much. The one thing, so I'm curious, the geography of farms in your area, you mentioned size and you got into practices, but yeah, how can you go into that?
Yeah, so farms, I've interviewed and worked with farms in 37 states, often and always through Nori connections. I think farmers are hearing about carbon markets a lot, and so there's a lot of investigation to see what's actually going to work. And so wide geography, and I've seen sizes from like that 60-acre field to like 40,000 acres. So, there's a lot of people looking into this in agriculture at large.
Awesome. And how do these people normally find out about Nori from your perspective? Because I don't even think I've asked you that question before, but we probably could do a better job of surveys. But yeah, how do they find out about Nori, and what's their knowledge of carbon markets in general when they reach your door?
I think that there's a lot of curiosity about what carbon markets can mean from a revenue perspective on farmland. And I think that curiosity, there's also a lot of marketing going on. Like, this carbon credits are a hot button topic across all industries. And so seeing it in ag is not surprising. And I think that's where people start to hear about Nori, and they're like CAR and the Climate Trust. There are other programs out there also working within agriculture. But
Awesome. And this is a tough question, but I really want you to be honest for people that are listening to the call right now. What's been your experience since 2020 working with Nori in developing these projects and getting them listed?
So there's definitely growing pains. That's the true answer to working on these projects. And that's true across the industry. And I'm running also a startup that has had plenty of its own growing pains as we figure this stuff out. But so I think the process has really improved over time. And I think right now I feel like we're on the precipice of being able to implement at a much faster, more like regulated pace. But it's definitely taken anywhere from, I think, like a feasibility study could take anywhere from 3 weeks to 3 or 4 months, depending on the farmer's availability and limitations on our side, and sometimes modeling limitations get in the way. And then a project, I know that like the 6 I've been working on that are currently in verification, we're excited about. I mean, some of them have been with me for a year, so I like give them a lot of credit for patience. Some of them have only been around for like 3 or 4 months and have moved much faster through the system.
Definitely. Awesome. Yeah, I see Andy went video on. I know we're almost bumping up against time, but maybe you'd be able to answer some of these questions too if we do have time for more.
Yeah, thank you, Radhika, Sean, and Claire. We do have a few questions that have come in. I think I'd like to take a couple minutes for that, and then we'll wrap it up. So first question is from Marty Meisler, and that is, do single regenerative practices qualify, or do you have to have a suite of practices?
No, a single practice would definitely qualify. Claire is nodding her head because she knows. You just have to have adopted it by the switch date, which is 2011 right now, no earlier than that. And I would say that some practices yield more carbon sequestration than other practices. And obviously, the more you stack, the more carbon we find being sequestered. So just the better your project will be. I don't know, Claire or Sean, if you want to add any more to that.
Quick question. Does the switch date progress with time? So would it start again at 2012 next year?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yes, it moves every year.
Okay, good. So let's see. Candace Woe is the next question. It sounds like Nori is a broker and also a financer of climate projects in ag. Are NRTs verified carbon offsets, or do they get the land offset ready? What is the value of the NRTs? Or there's too many questions there. So maybe you can take the first one.
Yeah, I don't consider us a broker. We're truly a marketplace. So we work with people like Claire or individual farmers who aggregate projects. And then the value of the NRT right now is $15. Like I think I mentioned, we think it's going to get up to $20. Eventually, we're going to have a token, which will hopefully drive price discovery. I don't know. Did I answer the questions you asked?
Yeah, I think so. And we also had a question that came in from Kara Rogers, who was asking about Web3. And I think you've covered that well with your presentation here. let's see. Let's just do one more question here.
I think one thing to add to with
Sure.
brokers, the reason why that's a misnomer is because we're more of a consignment store than anything. So we never take ownership over credits. The farmers maintain ownership over their credits. So that's the important distinction to make.
Okay,
Yeah, we don't take fees from farmers ever too. So that's the other thing.
last question here is from Gary Andrews. We have other questions, but as I said, we'll try to get those within the Word document answered. So has Nori approached corporate farmers with an outline proposal of how they might migrate to certain percentage of their agriculture to regenerative practices over a specified time?
I mean, we've never really like proactively approached corporate farmers. We have some fairly large farmers who have enrolled subsets of their fields. I think we have had multiple conversations with big land holding entities who then have farmers who participate and do regenerative ag practices. I think one of the concerns is around property rights and land ownership and what the carbon credit and who owns it. That is just going to take time to sort out. So, and then I would say, more generally, we're a backwards looking marketplace. So we think that as we show that the carbon markets are really truly here to stay and they are valuable and we show price discovery, will help people make the transition, but we will never be like forward paying for a practice. So you still always have to adopt it and at least wait a year and then come into our marketplace.
Great, thank you. Let's wrap up the questions there. I'm going to go ahead and share screen again. Okay, so I really want to thank our speakers, Kristen, Josh, Radhika, Sean, Claire, for their informative supply side descriptions and for addressing questions. I'd also like to remind everybody that next week's session, session 3, will cover the demand side considerations. And with regards to that, here is a sneak peek of the speakers from next week. And with that, I'll go ahead and close things out. Thank you very much for attending. We appreciate you being here.